The bitter winter wind of 1776 cut through General George Washington's worn coat as he stood on the banks of the Delaware River, watching ice chunks drift past like coffins in the black water. Behind him, the remnants of the Continental Army huddled around dying campfires, their feet leaving bloody prints in the snow. The revolution was dying, and Washington knew it. Just days earlier, his army had suffered crushing defeats across New Jersey. British General Charles Cornwallis and his Hessian mercenaries had driven the Patriots from New York, through New Jersey, and across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. What had begun as a grand fight for independence now resembled a desperate retreat of broken men. Enlistments were expiring on New Year's Eve in just 5 days, and most soldiers planned to abandon the cause and return to their families. Thomas Paine's words echoed in Washington's mind. "These are the times that try men's souls." The commander-in-chief understood that without a decisive victory soon, the American Revolution would crumble before the year ended. The British controlled New York, most of New Jersey, and seemed poised to capture Philadelphia. The seat of the Continental Congress, European observers were already writing the rebellion's obituary. Washington's spies brought disturbing intelligence. From across the river, Hessians, confident in their superiority, had settled into winter quarters in Trenton, believing the war was essentially over. Colonel Johann Roell, commanding the Hessian garrison, had dismissed warnings about American activity, reportedly saying that these country clowns posed no real threat to professional soldiers. His arrogance would prove costly, but Washington harbored a secret plan, one so audacious it bordered on madness. He would cross the Delaware on Christmas night, march 9 miles through a blizzard, and attack Trenton at dawn. Success seemed impossible. The river was choked with ice, the weather was brutal, and his army was demoralized and poorly equipped. Yet Washington recognized that sometimes the most desperate circumstances demanded the most desperate measures. As Christmas Day, 1876, dawned gray and forbidding, Washington summoned his officers to discuss the plan. Many thought their commander had lost his mind. Colonel Alexander Hamilton later wrote that the proposal seemed the product of desperation rather than strategy. But Washington's piercing blue eyes held a determination that gradually infected his subordinates. This would not be a conventional military operation. It would be a last roll of the dice that could either save or destroy the American cause. The preparations began in secrecy. Washington divided his force into 3 columns, with his own leading the main assault on Trenton, while Colonel James Ewing would cross downstream and General John Cadwalader would attack from the south. The plan required precise timing, perfect weather cooperation, and incredible luck. Historical accounts from the Smithsonian Institution suggest that Washington himself doubted the mission's chances, but knew that inaction guaranteed defeat. As darkness fell on Christmas night, 2,400 Continental soldiers began gathering at McConkey's Ferry. The password for the night was "Victory or Death," words that perfectly captured the Army's desperate situation. Understood that this crossing would determine not just the battle's outcome, but the entire revolution's fate. The young nation's future hung in the balance as his men prepared to challenge the winter darkness and professional European armies in one of history's most audacious gambles. The Delaware River on Christmas night, 1776, resembled a frozen hellscape more than a waterway. Chunks of ice, some as large as dining tables, crashed against each other with thunderous roars that could be heard for miles. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, and a northeaster was building strength, promising to turn the crossing into a nightmare of sleet and snow. Washington's men began loading into the Durham boats at McConkey's Ferry around 6 o'clock in the evening. These were not military vessels, but working boats designed to carry iron ore down the river 60 feet long, with high sides and pointed ends that could cut through ice. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment, experienced fishermen from Massachusetts, took charge of the navigation. Their weathered hands, new boats, and rough water, skills that would prove invaluable in the hours ahead. The crossing should have taken 4 hours. Instead, it took 9 agonizing hours of fighting ice, current, and increasingly violent weather. Captain Alexander Graydon, later described the scene as Dante's vision of crossing the river Styx. Horses reared and screamed as ice chunks struck the boats. Artillery pieces shifted dangerously, threatening to capsize vessels. Several soldiers fell into the frigid water and had to be hauled back aboard. Their clothes freezing solid within minutes, Washington himself crossed in the lead boat, standing at the bow like a figure from classical mythology. His aide-de-camp, Lieutenant James Monroe, future President of the United States, sat beside him, watching his commander's face remain impassive despite the chaos surrounding them. When ice threatened to crush their vessel against others, Washington calmly directed the boatmen to push off with poles and oars. The sleet began around midnight, driven by howling winds that turned each droplet into a stinging needle. His visibility dropped to mere yards. Several times, boats became separated in the darkness and had to be guided back by shouted commands and lantern signals. The cold was so intense that muskets began freezing, and soldiers feared their weapons would not fire when needed. Washington ordered his men to wrap their flintlocks in their coats and keep them as dry as possible. By 3 o'clock in the morning on December 26th, the last of Washington's force had reached the New Jersey shore. They were 3 hours behind schedule, soaked, freezing, and exhausted. 2 soldiers had already died from exposure, and many others showed signs of frostbite. The original plan called for a pre-dawn attack, but now they would have to assault Trenton in broad daylight, a significant tactical disadvantage that could prove fatal. Meanwhile, the other 2 prongs of Washington's assault had encountered even worse problems. Colonel Ewing's force never managed to cross at all, defeated by the ice and weather. General Cadwalader got some men across, but was unable to transport his artillery, forcing him to abandon his part of the operation. Washington's army of 200 men would face the enemy alone, without the diversionary attacks that were crucial to the plan's success. As his troops formed up on the New Jersey shore, Washington faced a critical decision. The tactical situation had deteriorated significantly. His force was smaller than planned, behind schedule, and would now attack in daylight against alert defenders. Any reasonable military commander would have called off the operation and retreated across the river. According to records preserved in the National Archives, several officers suggested exactly that course of action, but Washington had not risked everything to turn back now. He looked at his shivering, ice-covered soldiers and saw something that surprised him: determination rather than defeat in their eyes. The terrible crossing had not broken them. It had forged them into something harder and more dangerous. As dawn broke gray and cold over New Jersey, Washington gave the order that would echo through history: advance on Trenton, till victory or death. The 9-mile march from the Delaware crossing to Trenton became a test of human endurance that pushed Washington's army to the very edge of survival. The northeaster that had plagued their river crossing now unleashed its full fury, transforming the New Jersey countryside into a white wasteland of driving snow and ice-covered roads that threatened to shatter bones with every step. Washington divided his force into 2 columns to approach Trenton from different directions. He would lead the main body down the Pennington Road, while General Nathaniel Greene commanded the 2nd column along the River Road. The separation was risky if one column arrived significantly before the other. The Hessians could concentrate their forces and defeat each group separately, but surprise was their only advantage. Multiple approach routes increased their chances of achieving it. The soldiers suffering during that march defied description. Many had no proper shoes and wrapped their feet in rags that quickly became ice-crusted and useless. The snow was so deep that shorter men nearly disappeared in drifts, forcing their comrades to pull them along. Blood from frostbitten and cut feet marked their path like a crimson thread through the white landscape. Private John Howland of Rhode Island later wrote that the march was worse than any battle I ever fought. Captain William Washington, the general's cousin, rode beside his commander as they pushed through the storm. Years later, he recalled how George Washington never showed the slightest sign of discomfort. Despite being as exposed to the elements as any private soldier, when Washington's horse slipped on the ice and nearly threw him, he simply remounted and continued forward without a word. His example kept the army moving when lesser leadership might have seen the force disintegrate. The weather, though brutal, to endure proved tactically advantageous. The storm provided perfect concealment for their approach, and the Hessian sentries in Trenton were more concerned with staying warm than maintaining vigilant watch. Colonel Johann Rowell had dismissed reports of American activity across the river, convinced that no army would be foolish enough to operate in such conditions. His confidence in European military doctrine that armies did not campaign in winter would prove his undoing. As they neared Trenton, scouts reported that the element of surprise remained intact. The Hessians suspected nothing. Their Christmas celebrations had been enthusiastic, and many were still recovering from the previous night's festivities. The garrison's routine patrols had been canceled due to the weather. According to research from the Museum of the American Revolution, this tactical negligence by professional soldiers would become a case study in military schools for generations. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Washington's columns reached the outskirts of Trenton, simultaneously a feat of navigation and timing that bordered on miraculous given the conditions. The general deployed his forces with precision born of desperation. Captain Alexander Hamilton's battery unlimbered at the head of King Street, while Captain Thomas Forrest positioned his guns to control Queen Street. Infantry companies spread out to seal escape routes and prevent the Hessians from forming organized resistance. Washington sat his horse at the intersection where his two columns converged, a tall figure in a blue coat surveying the town that would determine his nation's fate. Behind him stretched two columns of soldiers who had endured more hardship in the past 12 hours than most armies face in entire campaigns. They were frozen, exhausted, and desperate, but they were also on the verge of striking one of the most stunning military surprises in history. The moment had arrived. Washington drew his sword and gave the command that would echo through American memory. Forward march, the town is ours. As his men advanced into Trenton's sleeping streets, none could have imagined that their desperate gamble was about to transform the American Revolution from a dying rebellion into a war that would shake the foundations of empires and change the course of world history. The Battle of Trenton erupted with the sudden violence of a thunderstorm on a clear day. At precisely 8:30 in the morning on December 26, 1776, Captain Alexander Hamilton's artillery opened fire down King Street, sending iron balls crashing through the wooden buildings where Hessian soldiers had been peacefully sleeping just moments before. The sound of cannon fire echoing off Trenton's buildings announced that the American Revolution had returned from the dead. Colonel Johann Rowell, commander of the Hessian garrison, stumbled from his quarters in confusion and disbelief. The previous night's Christmas celebration had left him with a severe headache, and the sound of gunfire seemed impossible to his military mind. Professional European armies simply did not attack in such weather during winter quarters on the day after Christmas. His aide frantically explained that American forces were pouring into the town from two directions, but Rowell's first reaction was to assume this was merely another minor raid by local militia. That assumption cost precious minutes that could have saved his command. By the time Rowell understood the magnitude of the attack, Washington's men had already seized control of the town's main streets and cut off most escape routes. The Hessians, caught completely off guard, struggled to form ranks while American musket balls whistled around them and cannon shots smashed through their attempts at organization. Captain Thomas Forrest's battery at the head of Queen Street proved devastatingly effective. His guns commanded the street like a bowling alley, preventing any Hessian unit from forming a coherent defense. When enemy soldiers attempted to charge the cannon, they were met by disciplined volleys from Continental infantry positioned in houses and behind barricades. Professional European soldiers, accustomed to fighting on open battlefields according to established rules, found themselves trapped in a deadly urban maze controlled by their enemies. The fighting took on a personal intensity that reflected months of frustration and desperation. These American soldiers had endured defeat after defeat, watching their cause seemingly die with each British victory. Now, finally, they had their enemies at a disadvantage, and they pressed their attack with ferocious determination. Private Elijah Churchill of Connecticut later described the battle as the sweetest revenge for all our sufferings. Washington appeared everywhere during the fighting, his tall figure unmistakable as he rode through the streets coordinating his forces. When 18-year-old Lieutenant James Monroe was wounded while attempting to capture a Hessian cannon, Washington personally ensured he received medical attention. The future president's bravery in seizing the gun position became one of the battle's most celebrated moments, as documented by historians at Colonial Williamsburg. Colonel Raoul, attempting to rally his scattered forces, led a desperate counterattack toward the American positions. His courage was admirable, but his tactics were fatally flawed. Instead of attempting to break out of the trap, he tried to fight a conventional European-style battle in conditions that favored his enemies completely. As he rode at the head of his men, a musket ball struck him in the side, sending him tumbling from his horse onto the blood-stained snow. The sight of their commander falling broke the last vestiges of Hessian resistance. Some soldiers attempted to escape across a sun-pink creek, but American forces had anticipated this move and blocked the bridges. Others tried to surrender, but the intensity of fighting made it difficult to communicate intentions clearly. Battle raged for barely an hour, but that hour contained enough violence and confusion to fill days of conventional warfare. As the gunfire finally died away, the eerie silence settled over Trenton. Smoke from muskets and cannons drifted between the buildings like fog, carrying the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic scent of blood. Washington's impossible gamble had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured, with minimal American casualties. The professional European troops, caught by surprise and trapped in unfavorable terrain, had been decisively defeated by the country clowns they had dismissed so contemptuously. But Washington knew the battle was only the beginning. Word of the attack would reach British headquarters within hours, and massive enemy forces would soon converge on Trenton. Seeking revenge, the aftermath of Trenton revealed the full magnitude of Washington's triumph and the terrible cost of achieving it. As smoke cleared from the streets, American soldiers moved among the fallen with a mixture of elation and exhaustion that spoke to their ordeal. They had accomplished the impossible, defeating professional European troops in pitched battle, but their victory came at the edge of human endurance. The casualty count told a remarkable story. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured, including 30 officers. 22 enemy soldiers lay dead in the streets, while 84 suffered wounds of varying severity. Against this devastating blow to enemy forces, Washington's army had lost only 2 men killed in action, both frozen to death during the march rather than fallen to enemy fire. Several Americans were wounded, including the young Lieutenant James Monroe, but none of the injuries proved fatal. Colonel Johann Raoul died of his wounds 3 days after the battle, but not before providing Washington with valuable intelligence about British positions and plans. The mortally wounded Hessian commander expressed his admiration for the American tactics, admitting that his force had been outgeneraled completely. His final words, according to witnesses, praised the courage of Washington's soldiers and acknowledged that he had underestimated his enemies fatally. The captured military supplies proved almost as valuable as the prisoners themselves. Army seized 6 cannon, 40 horses, and numerous small arms along with ammunition desperately needed by the Continental forces. Perhaps most importantly, they captured the Hessians' winter stores of food and clothing, providing immediate relief to soldiers who had been surviving on minimal rations and wearing rags. But Washington understood that remaining in Trenton would be suicidal. British General Charles Cornwallis commanded nearly 8,000 troops in nearby Princeton, and would certainly advance to retake the town once news of the defeat reached him. The American force, despite their stunning victory, numbered fewer than 2,400 men and could not hope to hold Trenton against such overwhelming numbers. The decision to recross the Delaware immediately after the battle proved wise but heartbreaking for the soldiers involved. Many had hoped their ordeal was over, that victory at Trenton meant they could rest and recover from their terrible night's work. Instead, Washington ordered an immediate withdrawal, forcing his exhausted men to march back through the same brutal conditions they had endured hours earlier. The second crossing of the Delaware proved even more difficult than the first. The soldiers were physically and emotionally drained from the battle, and the ice on the river had become more treacherous. As the storm continued, several boats were damaged during the return journey, and 2 more soldiers died from exposure. The victory celebration would have to wait until they reached the relative safety of Pennsylvania. News of Trenton's victory spread across the colonies like wildfire, transforming the American Revolution's entire character overnight. Newspapers that had been predicting the rebellion's imminent collapse suddenly trumpeted Washington's genius and the Continental Army's prowess. According to records from the Library of Congress, recruitment surges began almost immediately as young men who had previously avoided military service now sought to join the winning side. The psychological impact on both armies was profound. British and Hessian commanders who had grown comfortable in their assumption of superiority suddenly faced the disturbing reality that these American amateurs could outfight professional European soldiers under the right circumstances. The myth of invincibility that had surrounded the British Empire's military machine suffered its first serious crack. For Washington's soldiers, Trenton proved they could win. The victory transformed them from a collection of demoralized refugees into a genuine army that believed in itself and its cause. The men who had crossed the Delaware in desperation returned as veterans, who had proven themselves in combat against the world's most feared soldiers. As Washington established his headquarters in Pennsylvania and began planning his next move, he knew that Trenton was only the beginning. The British would respond with overwhelming force, seeking to crush this unexpected resurgence of American resistance before it could spread further. The news of Trenton's fall reached British headquarters in New York like a thunderclap on a clear day, shattering General William Howe's comfortable assumptions about the war's inevitable conclusion. Within hours of receiving the dispatch, the British command structure erupted into frantic activity as officers who had been planning victory celebrations suddenly found themselves organizing a massive retaliatory expedition to crush Washington's upstart army once and for all. General Charles Cornwallis, who had been preparing to sail to England for winter leave, received urgent orders to march immediately on Trenton with every available man. The British High Command viewed Washington's victory not as a tactical success, but as an unacceptable insult to the Empire's military prestige that demanded swift and overwhelming punishment. Cornwallis assembled nearly 8,000 troops, including some of Britain's finest regiments, for what he confidently predicted would be the American Revolution's final battle. The British force that marched from Princeton on January 2nd, 1777, represented one of the most formidable military machines in the world. Veteran regiments that had fought in Europe and the Caribbean moved with the precision of long experience, scarlet uniforms creating a river of red that stretched for miles along the frozen roads. Artillery trains rumbled behind the infantry, carrying enough firepower to reduce any American position to rubble. Washington, meanwhile, faced his own crisis of confidence and command. The victory at Trenton had been magnificent, but it had also exposed the fundamental weakness of his position. His army remained small, poorly equipped, and composed largely of militia whose enlistments would expire within days. Many of his soldiers had fulfilled their original commitments and demanded permission to return home to their families and farms. On New Year's Eve, 1776, Washington made one of the most crucial decisions of his career. Standing before his assembled troops, he offered a $10 bounty to any soldier who would extend his enlistment for 6 additional weeks. The speech he delivered that day was described by witnesses as passionate and desperate, appealing to the men's patriotism while acknowledging their sacrifices and hardships. The response was not immediate. Soldiers huddled in small groups, debating among themselves whether to stay or go. Many were farmers who needed to return to their families and prepare for spring planting. Others were simply exhausted by months of campaigning and defeat. For several agonizing minutes, Washington waited as his army's future hung in the balance. Then, slowly, individual soldiers began stepping forward. A sergeant from Pennsylvania moved first, followed by a private from Connecticut, then more, until entire units were volunteering to continue the fight. Not all remained. Perhaps half of Washington's force departed when their enlistments expired, but enough stayed to maintain a viable army. The moment marked a turning point in the Continental Army's evolution from a collection of militia into a professional military force. As Cornwallis approached Trenton, Washington made another critical decision. Rather than flee across the Delaware, again, he would stand and fight. The American commander had recognized that constant retreat was destroying his army's morale and the revolution's credibility. If the cause was to survive, the Continental Army needed to prove it could face British regulars in sustained combat. It's not just hit-and-run raids. The two armies faced each other across Assunpink Creek on January 2nd, with Cornwallis commanding. Overwhelming numerical superiority, but Washington holding strong defensive positions. The British general, confident in his advantage, prepared for a frontal assault that would crush the American rebels and end their treasonous rebellion forever. His officers, eager to avenge Trenton's humiliation, urged immediate attack. But Washington had learned valuable lessons from his recent victory. The element of surprise had been crucial at Trenton, and he began planning another unexpected maneuver that would confound British expectations and turn Cornwallis's strength into weakness. As darkness fell on January 2nd, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything both commanders had learned about warfare, leadership, and the revolutionary spirit that was transforming 13 colonies into a nation. The British Lion had roared its challenge. Now Washington would answer with a move so audacious it would echo through military history and prove that the Battle of Trenton was not an isolated triumph, but the first note in a symphony of American victory. The night of January 2nd, 77 witnessed one of the most brilliant tactical deceptions in military history. As General Charles Cornwallis prepared his 8,000 troops for what he expected to be a crushing dawn assault on Washington's trapped army, the American commander was orchestrating a maneuver so audacious that it would transform the entire character of the Revolutionary War and establish principles of irregular warfare, studied by military academies to this day. Washington's plan was breathtakingly simple and impossibly complex. While maintaining skeleton forces to keep campfires burning and create the illusion of a full army still in position along Assunpink Creek, he would march the bulk of his forces around Cornwallis's left flank under cover of darkness and strike the lightly defended British supply base at Princeton. The maneuver required perfect timing, absolute silence, and the kind of luck that separates legendary victories from catastrophic defeats. At midnight, Washington's army began one of the most challenging night marches in military history. The soldiers wrapped their musket wheels and cannon wheels in rags to muffle sound, while officers passed whispered commands through the ranks. The men who had endured the Delaware crossing and the march to Trenton now faced another supreme test of endurance as they navigated frozen roads and dense forests in complete darkness. Captain Alexander Hamilton, commanding one of the artillery batteries, later described the march as moving through a world of shadows and whispers. The cold was so intense that several soldiers collapsed from exposure and had to be carried by their comrades. Yet the army maintained its discipline and cohesion, driven by confidence earned through recent victory and absolute faith in their commander's judgment. As dawn broke on January 3rd, Cornwallis discovered the elaborate deception. His scouts reported that the American positions were virtually empty, except for a few dozen men tending fires and maintaining the appearance of an occupied camp. The British general, realizing he had been completely outmaneuvered, flew into a rage that his subordinates would remember for years. His overwhelming force had been rendered useless by an enemy who refused to fight according to conventional rules. Meanwhile, Washington's surprise attack on Princeton was unfolding with devastating effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Malhood, commanding the British garrison, had departed that morning with 2 regiments to reinforce Cornwallis, leaving Princeton defended by barely 400 men. When American forces appeared at the town's outskirts, the British defenders were caught as completely off guard as the Hessians had been at Trenton. The Battle of Princeton proved shorter but more intense than Trenton. British regulars, fighting on familiar ground with interior lines of communication, mounted a more coordinated defense than the surprised Hessians had managed. The fighting centered around Princeton's college buildings, where British forces attempted to make a stand while American artillery commanded by Captain Hamilton pounded their positions with methodical precision. Captain John Fleming of the Virginia, Militia distinguished himself by leading a charge that captured the British artillery position, while General Hugh Mercer fell mortally wounded while rallying his men against a British counterattack. The battle's intensity reflected both sides' understanding that this engagement would determine whether Washington's victories were genuine military achievements or merely fortunate accidents. The British resistance collapsed within an hour. The psychological impact of Princeton's fall reverberated far beyond the tactical situation. Two major victories within a week had demonstrated that the Continental Army could defeat professional European forces consistently, not just through surprise, but through superior tactics and leadership. The myth of British invincibility, already cracked at Trenton, now shattered completely. As Washington consolidated his position at Princeton, reports arrived that Cornwallis was approaching with his entire force, seeking the decisive battle that had eluded him. But the American commander had no intention of fighting on his enemy's terms. Instead, he withdrew his army to the defensible positions around Morristown, where the Continental Army would spend the winter growing stronger, while British forces frittered away their strength in futile attempts to control a hostile countryside. The twin victories at Trenton and Princeton had accomplished something that seemed impossible just days earlier. They had transformed the American Revolution from a dying rebellion into a viable war for independence that would ultimately reshape the global balance of power. European observers who had dismissed the colonial uprising as a temporary disturbance now recognized they were witnessing the birth of a new nation, forged in the crucible of winter warfare and tempered by leaders who dared to challenge empires. Washington's genius lay not just in tactical innovation, but in understanding that the revolution required more than military victories. It needed a transformation of American identity from colonial subjects to independent citizens willing to sacrifice everything for liberty. The soldiers who had crossed the Delaware in desperation returned as veterans, who had proven that free men fighting for their own soil could defeat the world's most powerful armies. The Battle of Princeton completed what Trenton had begun: the salvation of the American Revolution and the birth of a military tradition that would echo through centuries of conflict. Proving that in war, as in politics, the most important victories are often won not by the largest armies, but by the boldest spirits.